everybody, and welcome to another episode of Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and Tony has our bad idea for the week. Tony, what do we got today?
Today we're going to be talking about facilitated communication.
Well, just from the name, it doesn't sound that bad.
No, it definitely doesn't look that bad on paper, especially when you hear what it's trying to do. Facilitated communication is a technique in which someone who is incapable of speech, either due to autism or some other disorder, is able to use a facilitator to type out messages. Usually this is done by holding the elbow or wrist and assisting the person to type out whatever they need.
Assisting. Holding their elbow. You say, now I'm starting to see the bad idea already, Tony.
Yeah, you can kind of see the precursor to all this.
Yes.
It was developed in Australia by Rosemary Crossley. This technique was seen as the most important breakthrough in autism research, well, ever. It was perceived as a way to give a voice to the voiceless and to let people locked in their own bodies finally have a way to express themselves.
I feel like at this point in the podcast, before we go any further, I should point out that many people with autism are perfectly able to communicate.
This is for severe, nonverbal cases, as well as people with sometimes very severe cases of cerebral palsy, and also, according to Rosemary Crossley, people in comas.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yep. Dr. Douglas Bilkin saw the method in use in Australia and brought it back to Syracuse University and began to teach it to his students. He also began to run seminars to get it into schools and hospitals all over the United States. Out of nowhere, thousands of children who never spoke a word were able to type out full messages. 6-year-olds were able to write in paragraphs with perfect grammar and tense. It was an explosion of communication unlike anything seen before in the world of autism treatment. Here's a quick example written by a 2nd grader. Am I a slave or am I free? Am I trapped or can I be seen as an easy and rational spirit? Am I in hell or am I in heaven?
That's a very advanced 2nd grader.
Yeah, a 2nd grader that has never been taught the alphabet.
Or about rationality.
Or reading.
Yes.
So, there were some people that immediately started seeing the red flags, but this is something that I think it was mostly a hope-based thing that really took this off, but we're going to keep on rolling here.
Okay.
Children who had never been outside of special education classrooms all of a sudden went out into schools and did algebra, learned the works of Shakespeare, and so much more.
Well, that all sounds amazing, Tony. I can't imagine that there's a bad idea in there anywhere. Taking completely shut-in people possibly in comas to learn Shakespeare.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds so great and everything, and whenever you have a kid that hasn't talked to you at all. This is a complete and utter pseudoscience that's not that far removed from a Ouija board. The facilitators were completely taking over the child's arm to type whatever they thought the child needed. And one of the weirdest things about this is that there are a lot of people, especially the facilitators that were doing this, that said that it was an unconscious thing that they were doing. They were just kind of going with the flow.
Well, I think that that's something that, I mean, you brought up the Ouija board. I think that it happens in those instances. There is a sort of a subconscious flow level that humans can get into where they're communicating without knowing they're communicating. Have you heard of the amazing mathematical horse?
I have not.
This farmer had a horse who he would pose mathematical problems to, and the horse would stomp out the answer with his hooves. And it was amazing. People would come by and he would actually get the right answers. And it wasn't until much later that they realized that the farmer was subconsciously communicating when he wanted the horse to stop. He believed that the horse was stomping out the correct answers, and the horse was just picking up on some very subtle cues from his body language to say, oh, okay, 3 times 3, I'm just going to keep stomping until, and the horse, when the farmer would hear him get to 9, he'd be like, move his arm or something.
Yeah,
really,
just like a slight nod or something along those lines that just triggered it.
And the horse was like, okay, I'm cool. I get a sugar cube now. Not exactly the same phenomenon, but you can definitely.
No, I understand what you're saying about the subconscious part of it.
Yes, the farmer was well-meaning, but he was just wrong.
Many critics of this thought it was odd that children who had never been taught to read or been given remedial knowledge on a topic all of a sudden understood English at proficient grade levels, that they could do this while typing with one finger while not even looking at the device or alphabet squares. That's one of the weirdest things about this, if you look up videos on it, that they're just typing away, and they might like literally be asleep on the table. Or they'll be looking completely off in another direction, or they'll just be like doing something entirely different, not engaged, and they're just typing out these perfect sentences, and people just thought it was real.
It's so weird to me that they jumped immediately to alphabet stuff too. I would think if you were going to develop something like this, you would go with concepts like food, or different various needs they might have in their environment before you would jump into like just having a keyboard there. That's a very abstract thing to go to if you've never been exposed to it.
Yes, definitely. And the thing is, like, there's independent communication is always the goal whenever you have somebody that's nonverbal. And a lot of times you can actually have these sorts of like grid pictures and things like that in front of them. Like whenever I worked in schools, some of the kids with autism that were nonverbal, on their iPad, they had these apps, and it was basically macros that would say certain things or would have wants and needs so that they could just like hit the picture and just like go with it. It was something that they were able to understand and they were able to work with. It wasn't them like being forced to move into these situations. But of course, these kids were higher functioning than these ones, or the ones that were using facilitated communication.
Right. Well, it's easy enough to say this is bogus, Tony. How do you know?
Oh, doctors at the O.D. Heck Developmental Center in New York set out to test this.
The name of that thing. I'm sorry, nothing to do with this, but it sounds like somebody like named by a Mormon who was very mad but didn't want to swear. It's like, O.D. Heck!
In the O.D. Heck study, 180 trials were given. The test was simple. On a table, there was a T-shaped barrier separating the sight line of the facilitator and the facilitatee as they sat side by side. At this point, pictures would be shown at the far end of the T. With each trial, the trial members were shown a picture. Sometimes it was the same, sometimes it was different. They were told to type their response using the facilitator. Not a single response was correct when the images were different between the facilitator and the one receiving the aid. This was also done when the facilitator was working with the same client for several months or longer, so they were very familiar with that individual. It wasn't like they just grabbed random facilitators and put them with people. So if they showed shoes on one side and a hamburger on the other, they always put shoes. Things like that. Anytime the facilitator saw something, that was the thing that ended up getting typed out.
And as you mentioned, many of these people believed what they were doing.
Yes.
I assume that the principle here is that this person could sense sort of minute motions in the hands or fingers towards a letter, and that they would be able to just help them move towards that.
And once you kind of get on a roll with a sentence, it's easier to kind of figure out where they're going with something, and you just kind of like just roll along with it. So it's something that people thought that they were dedicating their lives to. Like whenever I was watching this, people that were part of it were talking about how much it changed their interactions with these students and how much different they looked at their students after this point, how they believed that it was pretty much their life at this point, and that this facilitated communication was such a huge deal. And some of these people were actually the ones that were in the O.D. Heck study, and they said that to have it just disproved of them that dramatically was pretty much life-altering at that point. It was something that they believed with every fiber of their being, and then had it ripped away from them definitively.
You don't ever, I say ever, you almost never see that with pseudoscience. Usually, the pseudoscience that's out there has been disseminated to a level where you can sort of put aside the contradictions as, well, that's just the big business or whatever, or that's just the bad guy. If you're sitting there, if you see it happen to you and have that belief personally shaken, that's a kind of disproof of one of these crazy ideas that I don't think happens very often.
Yeah, it'd be like taking a flat earther to the space station.
Yes. You could do it, but
it's not worth the millions of dollars generally.
It's generally not, no. And if you did, the other flat earthers would just say, well, you paid him off.
Yeah, they got to him. Some people were able to kind of explain this away. A copy of this study was sent to Douglas Bicklund at Syracuse. He believed that this test was too confrontational because you were asking facilitators and autistic trial members to prove themselves. That this made them too self-conscious and confidence was required to have facilitated communication work. He believed that under the circumstances, children that had been writing grammatically perfect paragraphs in poetry would be too flustered to type shoe or sandwich.
These testers were just mean, is what he's saying.
Yeah, basically.
They're just trying to. They just had a bone to pick and something to prove, and they didn't even care about these poor autistic kids. How rude.
The only thing I've ever seen Bicklund actually go back on is that he thinks that there are a lot of people who were misusing the test because they weren't tracking the eye movements of the kids to make sure that they were engaged, and that's the time where facilitated communication wouldn't work. But that's not, that's the only thing I've ever seen him backtrack on in interviews.
Is he still around? Still trying to do this?
He is now currently the Dean of Educational Studies at Syracuse University. He got promoted.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Sucky. Spoilers, I guess. I haven't read ahead, but yowza.
And as far as having confidence and everything, some of these were the same kids that had been put on stages at Syracuse and demonstrated their ability to speak in front of hundreds of people, but somehow the nature of the test in a comfortable private setting overwhelmed them. At this point, the cracks started to form, and some of the schools began to abandon the use of facilitated communication. But like all pseudoscience, it persists beyond reason or evidence. This is actually where things start to get dark. By 1993, more than 25 cases of facilitated communication revealed abuse and rape allegations by autistic children towards their parents. The facilitators would watch as the children typed out very graphic depictions of things that their family had done to them. By 1995, more than 60 cases had been reported. In the interest of time, we're only going to look at 2 of these cases. In 2007, the Wendrow family was torn apart by allegations of sexual misconduct. They had been using facilitated communication for many years because it was the only way they felt that they could talk to their daughter. With the aid of facilitated communication, she was able to attend standard high school classes and was often considered very bright. It was her goal to eventually become a professor, even though she was completely nonverbal, and it would later be proven that this was not working for her.
So when you say her goal, it was the facilitator's goal for her?
Yes. Then one day, her facilitator helped her type out lengthy descriptions of abuse by her father and 13-year-old brother. These were reported to the police, and the father was arrested and charged with crimes that would give a mandatory 75-year sentence. At the same time, their 13-year-old son was brought into interrogation rooms and absolutely grilled by police detectives, who lied and said that they had physical evidence of abuse and that he had been forced to participate.
Little sideline here. If you're ever brought in by the police and they demand a confession because they have evidence, never, ever, ever confess.
Yeah,
Get a lawyer every time. Does not matter what
defender.
They say.
Public defenders might not be great, but they'll at least tell you what to do in that particular situation. There are a lot of great public defenders. They're just overworked. Sorry. But yeah, I was watching the tapes of this, and this detective was absolutely laying into the kid. He just kept telling him, "You're not a good liar. You're not a good liar." And this 13-year-old kid, after hours of this, is just sobbing, on the table, just saying nothing happened. And it was just absolutely brutal.
The worst thing about those kind of interrogations is sometimes they can convince the people who they are interrogating that they are guilty of something.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's part of why there's a lot of lawsuits that came out of this particular trial later. They did not have any evidence other than the transcripts. At this time, facilitated communication had been derided in the justice system as pseudoscience, but in this particular instance, the district attorney, detectives, and everyone else involved in the case went full bore. Aislenn's father spent 80 days in solitary confinement waiting for his trial. At the trial, an expert named Dr. Howard Shane testified against the usefulness of FC and even helped set up a test to see if they could get Aislenn to do some basic communications with her facilitator unable to hear the questions. It was actually very fortunate that he was there because they were going to have her wearing noise-proof headphones, but he had the same headphones and used them because they took out ambient noise but not voices. So they were basically going to be making it easier for the facilitator to hear the questions that were going on. So he wanted to set up that T-style test and was able to stop them from doing that in court in a way that would have let the facilitator actually hear the questions. he's been doing this for a long time. Like in the 1993 documentary from Dateline, he was one of the first people that was speaking out against this. So he's been working for a long time to try to make sure that this is not something that that continues to happen in the court system.
Well, good for him.
Yeah, the prosecutor claimed that he was just paid to say that, even though he's done this many times in many trials and is one of the preeminent experts on why facilitated communication is bogus.
Well, that's another intricacies of the legal system, obviously, but paid experts don't necessarily... That doesn't mean that they're lying.
Yeah.
They probably did pay his way to come up there, but that doesn't mean that he's not telling you the truth.
Yeah, and he actually knows all the ways to test this. They wouldn't let him do exactly what he wanted with the test. They basically took the facilitator out of the room, asked Aislinn questions, and had her come back. And when they were very simple questions, are you a boy or are you a girl? And whenever they didn't know the answer to the question, she just typed out a string of random characters. They did this for several other questions, got the same result, and then finally they asked, do you know your name? And she only typed out afraid, which is actually something that's happened multiple times in these trials where a facilitator doesn't know how to answer the questions once they're under fire.
Oh, right. Again, Tony, you guys got to stop being mean. If they were just not being mean to her, she wouldn't have been afraid and she would have been able to answer the question. It's all the bad idea here is being mean to autistic kids, and I won't hear anything else.
Yeah. And also, there's one thing that a lot of people don't take into account with this right now, and that it's the psychological effect on the family, knowing that for more than a decade, they thought that they were talking to their daughter and having her respond just like a normal conversation, and finding out that this was actually something that didn't happen at all. Like, they did a lot of tests with other autism experts, and she wasn't able to identify a single, like, alphabet letter. She was unable to do this. She's fairly high functioning as far as her day-to-day life, like as far as being able to take care of herself in some ways, but she's completely nonverbal and not able to grasp letters. So for them to all of a sudden have all these things that they thought they had for her, this normal life that they had kind of pulled out, just swept away because of a facilitator, like in the midst of a giant trial, there's a lot going on here.
Obviously, there's also on top of that the fake rape charge. Yeah. Which will really mess a person up if it's not true. I mean, obviously, if it is true that someone has already been messed up, and that's a whole huge can of worms. But even in cases where people are proven innocent, their reputation, people always just kind of look at them different. They never are able to quite get back to normal life.
Exactly. Eventually, the case was dropped, but even now there are court cases popping up. Just this year, a Miami man was sent to jail for over a month and his child put into foster care because of a teacher using facilitated communications. The man was cleared after DNA tests, as well as finding out that the teacher had never even been trained in facilitated communication. He had just heard of it and decided to hold the wrist of the kid and type this thing out. What's crazy to me is that there are more and more cases of this still popping up. Like, there was a case at Rutgers University where the communicator, the facilitator, actually used facilitated communication to have the person that she was working with give consent to sex, and then she ended up having sex with him and got 2 rape charges levied against her once they proved that her facilitation wasn't actually working. Well, there's a lot of strangeness that happens with this particular pseudoscience.
The fact that would you say the dean of education at Syracuse University is still a big proponent of this? I mean, get that guy out of there. Science is a thing, and he should know about how it works. It's sad that your idea didn't work out.
Yeah, he's
I get
a doctor. The person that should be most able to be I made a mistake. I got overzealous.
It's not. There's no shame in that either. It's not. Scientists should be able. And I've just got done listening to a book called The Hunt for Vulcan about how for 100 years science held up the idea of this fake planet because of how it would have helped out proving some of Isaac Newton's equations right. And eventually, I understand that there's investment in ideas and it's hard to divorce yourself from it, but the proof against this is so overwhelming that this should really be an open and shut case.
Yeah, and people are still looking at this as a way for hope. Whenever I was doing research on this, there were a ton of videos alongside it, this is why facilitated communication is real, and this is like there's just a bunch of people still trying to propagate it out. And
It's tough.
I watched some of them just to see if like maybe I was being a little bit biased on this, and I'm like, these people just they want something so bad that they're gonna try to make it real.
And it's 100% understandable. That part of it, the
Yeah.
personal part, where you have someone in your family who is shut in, for lack of a better word, at least in their ability to communicate, and you think maybe they have other things that are normal and they're able to do some work, and you think, well, maybe they're just trapped. Maybe if I could just break them out of this prison of their mind and give them a way to communicate, maybe that would help them to be normal. And it's a wonderful thought, but this way of doing it doesn't work.
Yeah, and that's part of why Howard Shane got involved. He wasn't so much on the dealing with people with autism as much as people who could use like a switch or a computer program or anything where they manually basically inputted something so that they could find a way to communicate. Like you see people using those straws to be able to make a wheelchair work or things like that if they're quadriplegic, or being able to track eye movement to be able to type things out. Things like that are very, very good for independent communication. And this is just not that. Like one of the major things that people pointed out with this is that kids with autism can generally point things out. Like they don't have any problem doing that. Like they can make their finger into a point and go. Like this is just literally grabbing the arm and forcing whatever they want out there. And with the sort of savior syndrome that seemed to be happening with a lot of these people, these rape allegations just kept coming up. It's such a bizarre situation to me, and like a bad idea from the get-go. Like even if you're watching the woman who invented this, like Rosemary Crossley, you can see some of the other things she tried to do with people in comas, where she basically put like a rod on their head so that they could like look up, down, left, or right. And on the video she has where she's proving that it works, if you draw a line on the screen, you can see that she's moving the whiteboard and they aren't moving at all. Like it's just someone who did not do the proper testing. And it's awful to see what it did to these families.
It's a fascinating look into just the failure of human minds as well. Obviously, you start out with the kinds of things that require it, but then there's just the normal everyday failure of wanting something to be true and then shaping your reality to make it true in a way that doesn't work.
Anyway, I think that's going to do it for Bad Ideas this week. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for sharing this with your friends. Thank you to our patrons who are doing such a great job at supporting us. If you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/humanechoes. I hope you guys have an excellent week. If you want to send us bad ideas to research, check out badideasshow@gmail.com or find us at Human Echoes on Twitter.
And don't forget, if you were bummed out this week, tune in next week where we talk about video games.
We try to alternate for you guys.
Tony gets all the depressing topics, and I talk about fun stuff, like balloons. Y'all have
Bye,
fun.
everybody.